Con ustedes, nuestro speaker invitado, Chris Boyd, Lead Malware Intelligence Analyst de Malwarebytes.
Hello, and welcome to a Malwarebytes presentation with me, Chris Boyd, a Lead Malware Intelligence Analyst. Today, we're going to look at why ransomware is so effective and known prevention techniques. Thank you so much for joining us today. Here's a brief overview of the kind of things we'll be talking about. We're going to look at the anatomy of ransomware. We're going to look at ransomware defense techniques, and we are going to look at ways that you can recover from ransomware. So without further ado, let's get cracking with the anatomy of ransomware. Now, there are many ransomware trends. You may be familiar with some of these. Ransomware is very, very resilient. It doesn't matter what law enforcement does. It doesn't matter what security researchers and volunteer organizations do. You simply cannot get rid of ransomware. It persists. It keeps coming back. Some of the ransomware groups and gangs out there will go away for a little while and they'll come back with different names and different files, different attack techniques. So it's very, very difficult to get a grip on the ransomware problem. The threat actors have no limit on the kinds of attacks that they will attempt, the kind of networks that they will breach. I'm sure you're familiar with many of the more famous attacks over the last couple of years on healthcare organizations. We've seen attacks in various industrial sectors. There is no limit to what they will do. And the prevalence of these breaches increases something called fear fatigue, which is where individuals and organizations are so alarmed by the trends, the endless news out there every single day of attacks and infections and hijacks, they just sort of throw up their hands and give up in a way. They don't really know how to deal with the problem anymore. And there is a big, big need to avert ransomware attacks and quickly recover, of course. The longer this stuff stays on your network, on your systems, on your PCs, the worse it is in the long run. So, you know, we talk about the impact of ransomware. Every 2 seconds, a cyber criminal attempts a new ransomware attack. 37% of global organizations were victims of a ransomware attack. An incredible figure, 265 billion US dollars potential cost to victims of a ransomware attack. You know, these are big numbers. These are fast attacks. And there's a lot of organizations out there being hit. You know, and when a vulnerability is identified, a cyber criminal will most likely exploit it. And ransomware is the exploitation of trust, which is the trust we place in the encryption functions built into our OS and applications, and also the trust that we place in the privileges granted to user ID. Now, this is the how and the why of ransomware works. Of course, it encrypts the content in memory once you've opened and read the original file. And it may well destroy the original file in several different ways. It can save the encrypted file to disk and remove the original file using the delete file operation. This is a common technique that you see in lots of other non-ransomware attacks. You know, the infection file will get on the system and then it will delete all trace of original files, of the infection files that it drops along the way to the main infection. It can write encrypted content into the original file, and it can also save the encrypted file to disk and replace the original file using the rename operation. Now, in terms of ransomware attack learnings, this was a very famous attack. You may have seen it, the Colonial Pipeline attack in May 2021. It was a major pipeline used to ship across the eastern United States. It was attacked by the infamous DarkSide ransomware group, which caused mass panic buying of fuel, and the victims paid $4.4 million to make this problem hopefully go away. Now, the US government were able to recover the majority of the ransom. But when people talk about, you know, is it all theoretical? Do these ransomware attacks have a big impact in the real world? They absolutely do. Here's a JSB supplier in May of 2021. This is the world's largest meat company by sales. The attack scrambled meat buyers to find additional sources. In this case, they were attacked by the Revil ransomware group. Some people call it R-Evil, some people call it Revil. The end result is the same. And they paid 11 million in ransom on this occasion. So, you know, these are big attacks. These are huge organizations. And these are massive numbers that we're unfortunately throwing around. Conti is another major problem. in ransomware circles. It was first observed in 2020, part of the Wizard Spider group. I love these names. And it uses double extortion to force payments from victims. Now, more traditional old school ransomware attacks, they would infect your systems, they would encrypt the files, and they would demand a ransom. And if you paid the ransom, you might get the files back, you might not. Double extortion, and then now in some cases triple threat extortion, they will not just encrypt the files, but as an additional piece of leverage to ensure that you pay up, they will threaten to leak the files publicly or on the underground. Or they may have their hooks in other parts of your organization or your network and threaten to do terrible things to those. You know, there can be threats of denial of service attacks and all sorts of bad things unless you pay up. There are many notable attacks here. We're talking the city of Tulsa, the Island Health Service. That was a huge one that caused massive, massive impact on health services in Ireland, to the extent that the computer systems were completely shut down, and they had to revert to, you know, pen and paper to deal with patients on a daily basis. This is not a good thing to happen. And of course, a lot of these ransomware groups have lots of different associations with other ransomware groups. Some of them sell their files to other ransomware groups. Some of them make files for other groups specifically. It's a really tangled web out there, unfortunately. And some of these ransomware attacks go political. So Conti famously sided with Russia when the Ukraine invasion began. You know, warning, the Conti team is officially announcing a full support of Russian government. If anybody decides to organize a cyber attack or any war activities against Russia, we're going to use all our possible resources to strike back at the critical infrastructures of an enemy. So, you know, it's all hands to the pumps in terms of ransomware groups. You know, some of them are very political, some of them want to make a statement, and some of them aren't just primarily about making money and that's it. Yeah, and then also Conti attacked Costa Rica. Costa Rica announced a national emergency at one point because of these ransomware attacks, including its public health agency. There was a double extortion leak threat. You know, again, they're not just attacking organizations and businesses at the higher levels, they're going after governments as well. And they can and will hijack these machines and these networks. They went after the Ministry of Finance, they went after the Ministry of Labor and Social Security. The Social Development and Family Allowances Fund was affected. Initially, they asked for 10 million, but the government refused to pay. And the attack was claimed to have been pulled off by just 2 people, which, you know, is to have this level of impact is absolutely incredible. And at one point, Conti rebranded. A lot of the bigger attacks by ransomware groups tend to cause an awful lot of heat, not just at the government level, law enforcement, researchers. So they will tend to change the name, they will go away, they will resurface down the line. You're never quite sure if they've gone, you're never quite sure when they come back. And of course, anybody can say anything. In terms of, you know, we used to be with this group, we're now with that group, these files are ours. You never quite know in some situations if anybody is actually telling the truth. And in terms of infection mechanisms for Conti, you know, it's a wide variety of attacks. You've got spear phishing, you've got fake software pushed through search engine optimization, you've got phone calls, you've got malware distribution networks, stolen or weak RDP protocols. So, you know, the sky's the limit for some of these groups. They can and do diversify greatly when trying to break into a network. It's not just the same tactics and the same techniques over and over again. They develop, they improve, they go away, they come back with new files. Here, you know, you can see brute forcing IoT devices. You can see they dabble in exploits, very well-known exploits. You know, whatever it takes to get the job done and attack a system, make no mistake, they will do it. And in terms of stopping Conti, you know, there's this juggernaut of an infection. You know, you try and prevent the initial infection by locking down RDP brute forcing. So, you know, you make sure that there are passwords for RDP that are solid and well put together. You make sure that you can only try and enter a password a limited amount of times before the system will you know, kick you out and refuse you entry. You try and prevent lateral movement. Lateral movement is where the attacker gets a foothold on your network, and then they try and burrow deeper and deeper into your network as they go along. A lot of the time, it's very stealthy. A lot of the time, you won't know they're there because they may be trying to gather confidential files, important documents, things that you don't want to get out there into the outside world. And, you know, they will only appear very, very publicly and in your face with the ransomware at the end of the chain, once they've grabbed all of these files, once they've compromised all of your network and it's too late. You know, you can try and prevent ransomware execution in the first place with security tools, and you can reduce the ransom damage through proper data classification and storage, file recovery, offsite backups, because it's not enough to just make backups. You know, I've seen plenty of examples in the past previously where a company was hit by ransomware. They said, well, it's okay, we've got backups, we can simply roll back and everything will be fine. But when they went to look at their backups, they realized that in some cases the backups were hosted on site, so the backups had been compromised as well, or the backups were hosted off site, but they weren't very good backups. The files were all over the place, the folders weren't organized, there were things in there that people didn't know what they were, where they went, where you put them back when you got back on the network. So it's important to make sure that your backups are sensibly put together, otherwise they may well turn out to be worthless. Now, there are lots of ransomware detection methods out there. Here are some of the most common ones. There's static file analysis, which is where you look for known malicious code sequences or suspicious strings, such as commonly targeted file extensions and common words used in ransom notes. Now, as with all of these techniques, there are positives and negatives. In this case, there's a low false positive rate. It's effective against known ransomware, brilliant. And it stops attack before the execution takes place, so no files are encrypted. Unfortunately, it's very trivial to bypass. And so, you know, any malware author worth their salt will use packers and encryption tools. They'll replace characters, whatever it takes to get the job done, and trick this kind of analysis, which tends to be very basic and you know very straightforward to get around. There's common file extensions blacklists, which is the dynamic monitoring of file rename operations for well-known ransomware extensions, or when a new file is created with such an extension. Now, again, this has got a low false positive rate. It's very effective against common ransomware, and no damage is done. But again, like the file analysis, it's trivial to bypass. And there's several ways that malware authors can and will do this to get around these kinds of blacklists. There are honeypot files and deception techniques you can deploy. So, for example, your organization might create a bait file and monitor those changes. And once they're touched, that's considered an attack. Now, the plus point with this is that it can detect ransomware that static engines do not catch. But on the negative side, there can be false positives, as programs and users may touch those bait files. Files will be encrypted until ransomware touches the decoy files. And you can bypass by skipping hidden files and folders, or by targeting specific folders. So again, as with all these things, there's plus points and there's bad points. Number 4, we've got mass file operations, which is dynamic monitoring of the file system for mass file operations, such as rename, write, or delete within a certain period of time. If it exceeds a defined limit, you block it. Now, the plus point of this one is that it can detect ransomware that static engines do not catch. On the bad side of things, the files will be encrypted until the defined limit is exceeded. And you can bypass this fairly easily by adding delay between encryptions, or by spawning multiple processes to encrypt batches and groups of files. Now, finally, you can measure the changes of the file's data entropy. So you can track the file's data change rate to determine whether the file was encrypted or not. So, for example, entropy calculation can be used to measure the randomness of the data in a file. And this usually blocks after multiple flagged modifications with significant changes. Now, on the plus side here, it can detect ransomware that, again, static engines don't catch. And there are fewer false positives than the previously mentioned dynamic techniques. Unfortunately, there are some big drawbacks with this one. There can be high CPU utilization on the endpoint. So all your machines are, you know, they're working harder to get the job done. The files will be encrypted until a level of confidence is reached. So not all of the damage is blocked. And finally, you can bypass by encrypting only part of the file, or by encrypting in chunks using multiple processors to encrypt. So none of these techniques on their own are a surefire winner. The trick is to combine and make use of lots of different techniques and tactics to lock down the ransomware at the source. Now, in terms of ransomware recovery, you need a recovery plan. You need to contain the attack. You need to stop it from spreading out other parts of your network as fast as you can, which is why you also need to establish the scope of the attack. You need to communicate with the stakeholders. This is very important. Everybody that has a hand in the business should know exactly what's going on with the attack, the scale of the attack, how bad it's likely to be, what the recovery options are. You need to seek assistance from the experts. Not all companies have in-house security pros, certainly not to the level where they can deal with specific types of ransomware attack. There's a very specialized area of malware research and threats. Not everybody can deal with it. You need to preserve the evidence. All of this can be used by law enforcement and anyone else that comes along afterwards to try and figure out who did this, why, and can you track them down and punish them for what they've done. You need to identify the type of ransomware being used. You need to contain the breach. You need to rebuild those systems, and you need to reset, patch, and upgrade. And importantly, you need to also document all of the lessons learned. We've seen organizations that have been hit by a ransomware attack, and they fixed it, and everything was great. And then they went back and they fell victim, 3-6 months later to the same type of attack. Maybe it was a rogue attachment on an email and they enabled macros. Maybe someone at the executive level fell for a phishing scam. There are loads of different ways that the businesses can be attacked and attacked again with the same methods, with a high success rate, if the business does not learn the lessons of how they were breached, why they were breached, and what they can do to stop that particular breach and hopefully others happening again. So our recommendations are to identify the risk profile for the company, prevent what you can. Quite often you won't stop everything, but if you can stop most of what's happening at the very least, that is a very good place to be, and mitigate what you cannot prevent. So come up with ways, techniques, tactics, and tools that can mitigate what you cannot lock down in the first instance. Prevention might be as easy as anti-malware, anti-exploit, and mitigation might be compensating controls, controlled data recovery, the occasionally maligned cyber insurance, and even get yourself a communications expert for when you have to message out what's happened to the public, because in most cases you absolutely will, and that's definitely a good thing to have on your side should the worst happen. Well, thank you for your time. I'm very glad you've listened to me today. And on behalf of everybody at Malwarebytes, hopefully we'll see you again. Thank you.
Agradecemos a Chris Boyd por su participación en el IT Solutions Day. Ayúdenos a responder esta rápida encuesta.